righty. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Patrice Peterson, and I am the Peer Workforce Coordinator here within the Office of Consumer Affairs at New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Also representing the consortium, the New York City Peer and Community Health Worker Consortium, which is housed here within OCA, or the Office of Consumer Affairs. Today, we're presenting trauma in the workplace, and specifically for this first workshop in a three-part series, we're focusing on trauma and the impacts. We will be partnering for this, or we have partnered with some great organizations for you today for today's webinar, and I will introduce them all on the next slide. So first up, we have Kathy Cave. She is, as you can see, the Senior Training Consultant for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. She is also the founder of Inspired Vision Consulting, and Kathy comes to us with a wealth of experience training on trauma, culture, and inclusion for over 30 years. Next, we have Helen Skipper. She is the Executive Director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. She too does a lot of consulting, but specifically focusing on the hiring and retention of just those that are justice impacted. Good news, she's currently building a certification for those who are justice impacted, which will launch in March of this year as its first cohort, and followed up by a second cohort, in May. She's also on the board for PeerTAC, which you saw on the previous slide is one of the partnering organizations for today's webinar. And next we have Tina Brooks, who will be joining us shortly. She's the Assistant Director here at the Office of Consumer Affairs for New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I already introduced myself. We have Rita Cronice, the coordinator for PeerTAC at the Academy of Peer Services via Rutgers University. And lastly, we have both Maryam, who is represented by NIAPRIS and the Academy of Peer Services. And be on the lookout for Maryam in the chat. She will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation today, taking your questions and comments and any concerns you have. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention Laverne Miller, our legal representation or representative, Esquire, as you can see in her title. She made tremendous contributions to our presentation today and has been with us throughout the entire process. So I will end it there and pass it on to you, Kathy.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. What we are hoping to do together today is to really lay some foundation for thinking about trauma and the impacts of trauma, but also to link this directly to what we all experience in the process of doing our work and the process of living our lives, and really thinking about what trauma has to do with how we show up and what we experience in the process of our work. And so we want to think about some strategies, focus on self-awareness and self-care, and to really consider that there are things we can do in the places where we work that will lessen the impacts of trauma, really support people as we work in all the ways that we work, particularly those of us who work in peer support or are working in settings where some of us who work there may be involved in peer support, others may be doing other things. And if there's a theme that I would hope that we would take away from today, it's that trauma impacts all of us, and that a trauma-informed workplace really means changing what we do. Having a little trouble with advancing slides, so I apologize for the delay. So one of the things that we want to be thinking about, and a good place for us to start, is that, as my good friend Sherry Maid always would say, is in the thick of this work, we often forget about our own needs until they are so big, we can no longer meet them in simple ways. And what that means, for us and those of us who do the work around the intersections of trauma and domestic violence, trauma and sexual assault, trauma and institutionalizations, trauma and community experience, all the ways that people are harmed, is that we need to create a sense of, let me be reflective, let me notice what are the things that are impacting me today, so that when I step into my workspace and I'm working with human beings that also have their own harms, that I'm not doing more harm. So at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, one of our key areas of focus is cultivating self-awareness as a mechanism to support self-care. So I'm going to ask us to do a very quick and easy breathing activity to get us started today. So in thinking about trauma, thinking about what comes up when we talk about trauma, when we talk about healing, to really notice and pay attention, what is your body doing? So I'm going to ask folks to get comfortable in your seat. Put your feet flat on the floor. Put your shoulders back to open up your breathing. And then just take a deep breath in. One more. Notice where you're holding tension, if it's in your hands, in your shoulders, in your belly, in your hips, in your knees. Notice, breathe in, let it go. And if at any point during our time today, you feel overwhelmed, you feel upset, you feel that tension, think about the things that you can do to address what you notice is happening in your own body. So we have these capacities to self-soothe, to self-care, and to notice why we need it. So they're in our handouts today. One of them is a tip sheet that was developed by a friend of mine, Nikki Miller, who's an advocate who died last year. And she really talks about doing that self-awareness check-in. So it's that noticing, and that if you become overwhelmed, these are some things I can do about that. So that's one of the resources that you'll walk away with today, and hoping that you find that useful. The reason we do breathing and grounding and connecting kinds of activities is that grounding means that I'm more connected to myself. So when you take a moment before any conversation, before you're meeting with someone, before you start your day, to take a moment, take a breath, and connect to yourself. There are so many different kinds of grounding activities. So when we talk about connecting to ourselves, it's taking that moment so that we don't unintentionally harm people who are already struggling. And so this is a responsibility for each and every one of us, no matter our role, no matter what we do, no matter what our day looks like, to take a moment, self-reflect, get grounded, get connected to yourself, and then to move forward from that place. One of the resources I started to share was called Virtual Room of Refuge. Highly recommend it. They constantly are updating the different resources they make available, and they're really good to share in the workplace. Okay, so I want to spend some time laying some foundation about trauma and the way that experience shapes us. So if something happens to me on the way to work today, that may have to do with how I show up. It may change how I think, it may change how I am, it may change how I engage, but also my own trauma history may have those same impacts. There are trauma reminders all around us. And so again, it's up to each and every one of us to learn about what are the things that activate our fear response. What are the things that indicate that today's going to be difficult, or I need a minute before I start my day, or before I talk to my next person. So let's talk a little bit about trauma, define trauma, and really think about the ways that we're impacted because we're human beings, not because we're peer specialists, not because we work in peer support, not because we're recovery coaches, not because this is not a deficit-based way of thinking. Being trauma-informed is recognizing that trauma impacts all of us because we're human, and that no one of us is more capable of supporting another human being than any others of us. It's sometimes what we know, it's sometimes being aware, it's sometimes being able to check ourselves for how we're showing up. But we all have capacity to show up. So when we talk about trauma, so this is a definition that we use at the National Center. And we talk about individual trauma, and we also talk about collective and historical trauma. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on those things. So trauma is a unique personal experience. There could be 5 people in a room. Something happens that is upsetting or overwhelming, or has the potential to be. Some of us will be impacted by that, maybe debilitated by it, overwhelmed by it. Some of us will move towards it and try to either eliminate the threat or support others to navigate the threat. So we all have different ways of showing up. And just because I've been impacted by trauma in one part of my life doesn't mean I'm definitely impacted in a traumatic way in other parts of my life. And there are other times where everything can make it a bad day. And so there's no such thing as being able to predict how each and every person shows up. We have individual experiences to individual threats. And it could be a threat of harm or safety to myself or to a loved one. But what's essential to hold is that in those moments, an individual's coping capacity or their ability to figure out what's going on, let me think about this, let me know what it is, let me figure out what I want to do, that our capacity to do that is overwhelmed. So sometimes when someone is having a trauma response and we want to keep talking with them or we want them to go to work, we have to recognize that in those moments they may not be physically able to do that. The other layers of thinking about trauma have to do with collective trauma, which is any group or community experience, which unfortunately we are dealing with all the time as human beings. We have community shootings, we have hate crimes, we have homelessness, we have racism, we have all the ways that a whole community or group of folks can be othered, can be traumatized because of identity or where they live. So think, for example, experiences of people who identify as transgender and the kinds of targeting that they experience. That is something that is happening to an entire group of people. And so making sure that we notice and pay attention when things are coming up in our communities and checking with each other about how we're doing. Cultural trauma is the systemic destruction of people. So whole groups of people based on their traditions, their language, anything that makes them different and unique, that there's a power over. So if we think of colonization, we think of genocide, we think of the Holocaust, we think of the experiences of Indigenous folks, and we think of the experiences of enslaved Black folks. So these experiences are in history, but are impacting us today. And there's a definition for historical trauma that always has resonated for me that we use at the center. And it's the cumulative emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group cultural trauma experiences. So when a whole community a whole group of people is traumatized, and those impacts resonate over generations. And so if you find yourself thinking about, why don't they just, and then, stop or get over it? I mean, those things have been said directly to me as a Black woman. And what I can say to you is that those impacts ripple out and resonate over generations. And so holding that any of us could be impacted by all of those things at any point in time. And so if we're not creating space for conversation and recognition, then we may be doing harm. And so these are all the ways we want to show up and hope to show up in our work, with dignity and respect and kindness and mutuality and all of these pieces. We hope to be transparent. That's letting people know and being predictable about, this is what's expected. This is what your work is. Let's make sure that you feel prepared to do what you were asking you to do. We want to be understanding and trustworthy. And there's much, much more, but we also, don't always show up in these ways. And so when we wonder what gets in the way of that, what gets in the way of how we intend to show up, trauma has a lot to do with it. So I'm going to pause here and invite Skip to join the conversation.
Hey, thank you. That was so resounding, and that just hit me in so many ways, so many spaces. I'm still actually reeling from the historical and cultural definitions of trauma that just hit me in so many areas. But right now, as I specifically look at trauma from a justice impacted point of view, and I specifically look at trauma and how it impacts those of us who are directly impacted in the workplace, I need to look at the twin evils of prisonization and institutionalization. And while people might think that they're the same thing, they're actually probably made out of the same coin, but there are two different sides to the same coin. And while people think and they want to laugh about what they consider to be institutionalization, it's actually not a laughing matter. And it allows us to perpetrate the trauma and the harms that are fostered against those of us who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So let me just explain what I mean, and then you'll understand what I'm talking about. So when we talk about prisonization, this is when someone enters into a period of incarceration. This is when they lose their agency. And agency is the right to say how you move. And when I say how you move, I'm using that in layman's terms. Your agency is your right to decide whether you go right or left, to decide whether you get up or stay in bed, to decide to do what you want to do, to make your own decisions. That is your agency. When you enter into a period of incarceration, you lose your agency, you lose your actual personhood. What makes you an individual, your right to decide whatever you want to do, you lose that. When you enter into incarceration, you assimilate into how the spaces ebb and flow of things. So if this is an institution that wakes up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you assimilate into that. You learn how to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. If the lights go off at 10 o'clock, you learn how to go to sleep at 10 o'clock. If you are incarcerated for 20 or 30 years, this becomes ingrained within you. Soon the lights don't have to shut off for your body to just shut down at 10 o'clock. The lights don't have to pop on at 6 a.m. in the morning. Your body becomes used to that. And at 6 a.m., you pop up, you're up and ready to face the day. And if you're doing this constantly for 20, 30 years, this is ingrained within you. And this is what happens. That is what prisonization means. That is you fully assimilating into whatever rules and regulations that happen in that period of incarceration. Now, when you are released from that period of incarceration, that prisonization flips on its head and it now becomes institutionalization. And this is what people tend to hee, ha, ha, and laugh about. Oh, he's institutionalized. He's still thinking he locked up. She walking around like she's still locked up. But it's not really a funny prospect. It's not a funny situation. And people laugh because we're still dragging around the vestiges of the trauma and harm that's been inflicted upon us as we're incarcerated. So yes, we're still used to getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Yes, we're still used to going to bed at 10 o'clock at night. But how does this play out on us when we're in a workplace? Suppose for 30 years, I've been used to getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and going to bed at 10 o'clock at night. And the only job I can get is doing something overnight. How does that play out? When I'm working an overnight shift from 12 o'clock midnight to 7 o'clock in the morning, yet I'm used to going to bed at 10 o'clock at night and getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's not going to play very well with working an overnight shift. Am I going to be successful on that job? Probably not. Or here's another situation. I've been locked up for 30 years. I've been away from Pepsi, from soda pop for 30 years. They don't give you soda doing these institutional meals, but I've been away from Pepsi for 30 years. I get released and I get a job in a fast food restaurant. And guess what? There is Pepsi and it's free for me. And I'm taking advantage of that. But I've also been in a place where I have lost my agency. And as a grown adult, I still have to ask to go to the bathroom. But I'm working a job where I have free soda and I'm availing myself of that. But I still got to ask to go to the bathroom. Now I'm drinking all of this soda, but I'm on a workplace, but I'm used to asking to go to the bathroom. And you see how those just don't coincide? But I'm so used to asking to go to the bathroom, but I'm on a job and now I got to ask to go to the bathroom, but I don't have to, but that's so ingrained within me that I do. And people start making fun of me. Now I'm traumatized. I'm wondering whether I should self-disclose. And I don't have to, but because they're making fun of me, I'm wondering, should I? And instead, I take it to a negative level because they're making fun of me because I'm already traumatized by being incarcerated. Now I don't want the stigma if I self-disclose. Now I'm feeling disrespected. And guess what? I end up losing that job. All because of the trauma of being incarcerated, because I'm still institutionalized, because I got a job where I got free soda, which made me have to go to the bathroom, because I'm institutionalized and I'm so used to asking, can I go to the bathroom, where I really didn't have to ask, but that institutionalization is still heavy on me. And I don't have a peer to help me work through that barrier, because that is a barrier. And it's part of the trauma that's been fostered on me while I was incarcerated. Now, how am I supposed to work a job? And that's my piece. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to me. But these are all parts of trauma that we must take a look at. And whether we perpetrate or continue the harm, knowingly or unknowingly, this is all a part of becoming trauma-informed. When we become trauma-informed, we don't do this knowingly because now we're informed. And I'm going to pass it back to Kathy. Thank you for giving me this time. I appreciate you all. Everybody stay well.
Skip, thanks so much. I wanted to let folks know that Skip is going to be leaving us soon. So I wondered if anyone has any questions or thoughts to share about what Skip put in front of us today. Now would be a good time to ask before she leaves us.
Valerie Bowling has a hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Valerie.
Skipper, what about the violence that's embedded because of being institutionalized?
That is very valid point. very violent. And that is also another aspect of how that situation could have turned bad in a really quick, hot minute. So when that person felt disrespected because people were making fun of him, and by the way, this is a true story. I actually worked with a young man when I was still in direct service as a peer. I actually worked with a young man who this was his story. And he lost his job, and he did go to violence because that's all he knew. Part of the traumatization that was fostered upon him. And this is how he fought back, was violence. And I worked with him through all of this. And when they started making fun of him because he kept asking to go to the bathroom, and they started making fun of him and like, what are you in kindergarten? You always got to ask, go to the bathroom. He didn't know how to explain himself. He didn't. And his only response was to fight. And of course, he lost his job. But I worked with him, and I explained, and I took him through the steps. And when he got another job, he was able to reason within himself and work through the steps that we had worked out. And his next job, he was able to retain. But this was a process, but it was a process he really didn't have to go through if everyone was trauma informed. And that's just the thought that I was putting out there. If we are all trauma informed, and that includes the workplace, the workplace had a part to play in it as well, you know, because the HR department knew that he was formerly impacted, but his direct on the floor supervisor didn't know. You know, and if that person was trauma informed, that person could have diffused the situation and didn't know and did not. And it just rapidly escalated. You know, there's lessons in all of this, but thank you for that. I appreciate throwing that out there.
Helen, about the prisonization, is it just stories we're hearing, or is it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Is it just a lot of stories we're hearing, or it's just a lot of violence in the prison?
Well, let me just say that prisonization is often a mechanism to survive. And sometimes it leads to violence. Sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times it's a mechanism to survive. It depends on where you are and who you are before you even step into incarceration. And I also want to say that different genders, different cultures experience incarceration very differently. Women experience incarceration very differently from men. Youth experience incarceration very differently. LGBTQ experience incarceration very differently. Indigenous experience incarceration very differently. Different cultures experience incarceration very differently. So a lot of that has to do with who you are, how you were brought up, what your life experiences were, how you were formulated before you even stepped into incarceration, how you assimilate into incarceration. And it also depends on what type of incarceration you're assimilating into. What is already there? What type of atmosphere is already there?
We are going to talk about trauma responses, and I feel like that there's a connection here, Skip, to what you're saying about
yes, there is.
What someone's experience is. There's your life trajectory. There's all of the historical impacts and the cultural impacts of trauma. And then there's what happens when we've experienced these things and we go up to work. So I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
If you are a certified peer, an OMH certified peer, the Justice Certification course on the Academy of Peer Services will roll out soon. And this is a course that I have built. Under that course, there is a module called the Incarceration experience. And in that module, we talk about the differences of incarceration as experienced by the different types of people. And what I was just talking about is really fleshed out in that module. I invite you all, when it rolls out to the general public, as every certified, you do have to be a certified peer, whether provisional or not, you do have to be a certified peer to be able to access that course. But I invite everyone who works with the justice impacted population, which is who this course was built for. I built this course, to please take this course and you will fully understand what I'm talking about. If you work with the justice impacted population, this is actually a course that you need to take. And I invite everybody to avail themselves of it. You guys have my information. If anything else is needed, I will put it in the chat. Please hit me up. I am available to talk further about this. Right now, I have to go. I have class. Sorry. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Skip. Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Have a great day, and thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Stay safe and be well. I'm putting my information in the chat. Bye, everyone.
Bye. We also will make the slides available to folks, and the end slide has contact information, so you'll get to have the information you need to reach directly out to Skip should you like to do that. We felt that it was really important to include that conversation because many of us are justice involved peers. Many of us work with justice involved peers. And when we talk about finding meaningful work, and we know how important meaningful work is to healing, right? We know that. It's not a question. So what are the things that happen in the workplace that disrupt our capacities to stay present, to stay focused, to be able to work, to feel supported, to feel welcome, to feel included? And so these are the things that we'll be talking about in this series, in this webinar series. I wanted to share this graphic about ACEs and the realms, 4 realms of ACEs, and really thinking about how do we expand our belief, our knowledge around adverse experiences. So typically when we talk about adverse experiences, we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. And we need to expand our lens so that we're talking about and thinking about what happens in our household, whether, across the lifespan, the trauma we're exposed to. So we often don't think about, for example, intimate partner violence or domestic violence or sexual assault of adults as part of traumatic experiences, unless we're specifically doing that work. And the reality is that many of us, particularly folks who have mental health challenges, folks who have used substances, one of the things that we know is that there's a connection between having those concerns and conditions and being vulnerable to being abused by others because of the way we cope with trauma, because of the way we show up, because of the way that we may not be aware of what's happening in those moments. And so when we think about what are the traumatic experiences in life, what are the adverse experiences in life, some of those experiences have to do with our early childhood. Some have to do with our community experiences. Some have to do with actually what's happening with our climate. And then the 4th realm is cultural. So all of the things, it's just another way of looking at the definitions I was sharing earlier, really thinking about and noticing and knowing that trauma can come from any of these sources. And it's not up to us in our workplace to say, oh, your trauma is related to this and your trauma is related to that. What we need to hold is to be trauma informed means that we understand the many sources of trauma and that we think about what the impacts might be. And we're curious. If someone is not showing up the way they want at work, or they're being their best selves at work, to one, not have our workplace make that worse, and two, to have a curiosity around what would be helpful. And so for us to be thinking about broader than adverse childhood experiences, trauma is over the lifespan and it's pervasive. Another way of saying that is that there are multiple sources of impact for one person. And so I often will think about, what's in the box of stuff that is impacting me. And there could be many things. It could be financial. It could be that I'm experiencing microaggressions in my workplace or feeling othered in my workplace. It could be that I need something and there are barriers to access. So when we think about what it means to be trauma informed, it's holding that we all have our own experiences, that there may be things that come up in our work that are traumatizing, and we need to be able to talk about that and talk it through. That being impacted by either our own experience or secondary trauma, which is someone else's experience, that it makes sense that if we care this much, if we are so present in all of these ways for each other, that we might be impacted by someone else's story, by someone else's experience. But also, if I go to work and based on who I am, what I look like, whether or not I'm a peer specialist, whether or not I'm a person of color, whether or not I'm straight or a lesbian, any of those things would somehow be interpreted as permission by someone else to harm me or to make me feel like I don't belong. And so because of history, because of experiences with violence, because of all the ways that coercion shows up in our institutions, in our intimate relationships, in our workplaces, that we need to have workplaces that are welcoming, that don't replicate harms, that don't make me feel worse about who I am and how I am. And so for folks to be thinking about that, and if you have any other ideas around traumatic impact or where trauma could come from besides what's listed here, please don't hesitate to add to the chat. When our workplaces actually perpetuate harm, they bring about things or situations that are othering, that are dismantling of human beings, that they disrupt connection. They can make folks feel, you're here, but you're not welcome here. And so these mixed messages can also, for trauma survivors, really tap into that sense of the world is not a trustworthy place. So when it doesn't really matter if we intend to be harmful or don't intend to be harmful. It's if there's harm, that's a signal we need to change something. And I guess the question for all of you who hire folks, who supervise folks, who are in charge of some of the spaces in your work. So you supervise someone, you have some decision-making power, some formal authority. How welcoming and inclusive are you? And how intentionally do you work towards having a trauma-informed workplace? So a trauma-informed workplace would be sensitive to human rights and social justice. We would be thinking about those things. We would be thinking about how every person is an individual, and we need to think about their individual strengths. And in terms of staff development, what are their growth areas, and support that to happen. So when an organization doesn't treat people equally, doesn't treat people fairly, there's not a sense of equity about the work, how the work is done, how the work gets assigned, how we support each other as we do the work. If those are not conversations that you're having, then we have much work to do. And most places have work to do. Sometimes people are over surveilled. And let me talk a little bit about that. What I mean by that is when, for example, we have to Skip's point, we have someone who's a peer specialist who is just as impacted, but also that impact has made them a great resource for providing peer support to someone else. And so in an environment where we have peer support, we may have peers as part of other kinds of teams, and then we expect that person to hold all the peer conversations. We expect that person to report on the activities of their members. We expect that person to do things in the work that are not in alignment with peer support values and principles, and yet we call it peer support. And then we watch that person. We don't provide supervision to other people, but we supervise this person. And so what I would say is that everyone benefits from effective supervision, not just folks who have the identified label of peer specialist, or are only the new person, or someone has 10 years experience, so they don't need anything. That's not how this works and works effectively. So if the place where you work is deficit focused, we're not thinking about growth, and we're not thinking about how we can be more trauma informed in the ways that we supervise and support staff and in the ways that we work together, that these are things that perpetuate more harm. So throughout this series, we'll be talking about other examples of this, and we'll be talking about some strategies for making change. I wanted to spend a few minutes sharing a way of talking about trauma responses that are accessible and easy and actually do describe what's happening without talking a lot about neuroscience. So again, we're thinking about conversations in the workplace. And while more training is great, understanding trauma responses from a place of what's happening in my body can be a really wonderful resource for healing. But also different people learn different ways. And so I've used this conversation that I'm sharing with you right now to talk with folks from all kinds of places and spaces, with survivors, with people who work with survivors, with friends, family, and colleagues. And so a simple explanation about what's going on. We get information from our internal, that spidey sense, my friend Wilma likes to say, and from our senses. So what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell. And so for me, one of the things I am really sensitive to as a survivor is smells. There's a set of smells that together really do set off all the alarms that I have. And that combination is human body odor or body sweat, musty basement smell, and cigarette smoke. So any one of those things on its own doesn't bother me. Those three things come together and my fear senses are off the charts. And so what happens is this information comes to our brain sounds the alarm, and these are automatic responses. I don't have control over whether or not my response is fight, which could be, physically wanting to fight someone, or could simply be that sense of rage, anger, argument, and I want to just argue about everything. Like that's a human response and it's automatic. Flight is I'm out and there's not time to think about it. We're just running. It's a reaction. It's not a thought process. So it might be leave the room, disengaged, and it might actually be to run away, to not show up for your next time that you plan to meet, for example. And freeze is that deer in the headlights. I am not going anywhere. I'm right here. Sometimes people are aware of these automatic responses. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes responses are visible. Sometimes they're invisible. So it can be really challenging and difficult to know if someone is having a threat response. So we need to be okay with being able to ask, are you okay? Is there anything I can support you with? You need any assistance from me today? And it doesn't have to be we're talking about everybody's trauma all the time. What we're saying is do that self-check. And then if you're my colleague, I'm going to work with you. And is there anything that we need to talk about? before we get started? Are you good to go? Sometimes people have socially learned responses to threat. So if I know that someone abuses their power and I'm in their company, I may choose not to engage with that person, or I may be on hyper alert and watching to see if I need to be afraid of that person, or if I need to do something to lessen the threat or to try to lessen the threat. So I really want us to think about, we don't know anybody else's pain. And so in our workplaces, that means we need to have strategies and resources available for folks when they need it. And so again, more as we talk, but really thinking about not blaming people for the trauma responses that are automatic, that they can't help. So we can learn new ways to cope, and that takes time and energy and focus. Sometimes that alarm is constantly on. So it could be that we're in constant danger or expecting and staying on alert because danger could happen. If I'm in my workplace and I have a supervisor who's been yelling at me, I'm now on alert for that yelling at me. And I'm watching, I'm learning, I'm listening. And that's for my protection. And I might be aware of that. I might not be aware of it. And just by saying to someone, you're safe with me, don't worry about it, does not mean that they are safe. And you can't determine safety for another human being. And so there's a lot to think about in terms of this workforce stuff and understanding trauma and really thinking about it. And there's a lot of conversation of post-traumatic stress disorder. People will say, oh, my trauma, and I have PTSD. That is only one way that trauma shows up. Trauma shows up as being on alert. Trauma shows up as that there are trauma reminders and I'm responding to them. And so as we think about what that might look like in your workplace, what kinds of trauma reminders might come up? So I'm going to ask folks, I'm going to share some, but if there are others that you think of, please add it to the chat. That sometimes it's the way things look or smell or feel. You know, when I think about, again, what Skip was sharing about justice involved peers, many of us have worked in spaces where there's bars on the windows. And while to other folks, that might not seem like a big deal, or it might be, oh, this is for our safety and our protection. It might for me or for someone else be a trauma reminder that sets off all of the same responses as the original trauma. When people don't have choice and power, when there's conflict or separation or loss or big changes. So I used to work over here, now I work over here and I do these things. Well, I was comfortable and confident about what I did over here, and now I'm doing something new. That may bring up trauma reminders for folks. When we have disruptions in our routines and we can't do the things that are grounding and connected, being overworked, being exhausted, feeling threatened, and just chaos or that sensory overload. So many of our workplaces are very busy, very energetic, not saying that they shouldn't be. Some of us do crisis-related work. And because we do crisis-related work, we sometimes find ourselves in crisis. And so any of these things and others can contribute to that sense. So I wanted to pause for a minute and see if there's anything in the chat that we needed to catch up with or think about, talk about together.
There was just one piece I wanted to mention. Someone questioned what fawning mean. And I just wanted you to identify. They've added some definitions in the chat, but I wanted you to be the person who gave them what your perspective was.
Sure. So I am not a fan of the term fawning, actually. And so what people typically mean when they talk about it is that if I am in the presence of someone that I feel has power over me, has authority over me. And it could be but because of the way they look. It could be because of their position. It could be because they have power, actual power over me. Then I'm going to do everything that I can to placate that person, to make sure that person is comfortable, to make sure that person has what they need so that they don't harm me. And what I will say to you is that it's often kind of put up as a fourth automatic response, and it's not. It's socially learned. And the reason we need to think about it is it's, for example, for someone who's been a victim of domestic violence, that in that moment, I may want to or be trying to keep my children safe. So if someone in my home is harming me, to keep my children safe, I'm going to do everything that person wants, but it's because of abuse of power that they're in that position. And so often clinicians will use the term fawning without understanding the dynamic of where it comes from, or that it may be the only survival strategy that someone has. And so I caution around the use of the term because I think it's often assigned without an understanding that it comes from a place where someone has been abusing power, using their power over another person or group. And so that people respond to the person in power in ways where they won't be further harmed or to protect someone else. So we really need to pay attention to that and know what it is and where it comes from. And that it actually is not helpful to view folks as, you're doing what you can to get along. What they're doing is trying to survive. And so what that means for those of us who have power, maybe positional power because of the roles we have at work. I might be a supervisor and I'm supervising people who have less power and less formal authority than me. I need to be aware of my power and to use it carefully, to use it in ways that actually lifts people up rather than helps hold people down. And so much more to say, and we can come back and talk about that more in terms of how in our workplaces, those of us who have power need to think about how do we share that power? How do we elevate voices that are in the margins? And how do we use our position to do that rather than use power over?
Thank you, Kathy. Before you move forward, there was one earlier in the chat. If the peer movement is our workplace, how can we help shape it to more trauma-informed and safe for all people to work in? Sometimes I find a peer movement more harmful than a traditional workplace. In a traditional workplace, there are legal repercussions for harmful behavior. How do we hold each other accountable, accepting and helpful for all of in the national and local peer movement? How do we work with peer historical trauma? Sorry for the glitch.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you for the question. So first of all, I want to say that is a huge conversation. We can certainly touch on it in the next two webinars, and we will. But what I will also say is that Darby Penny and I created a curriculum on trauma-informed peer support for just this reason. And when we think about this movement and we think about the ways the movement has been co-opted to be more of a business, when we think about how much power is in the relationship in peer support, and we don't talk about that power. We talk about mutuality as if it's already there. It's something we have to work towards, and it's aspirational. And there are so many times in any given day where we are behaving in ways not in alignment with those principles. And so it's a bigger conversation than we have time for today, but we will touch on it. And certainly you can reach out. You'll have my contact information. Trauma-informed peer support really means that we have to look at our own behavior in this movement. and it means we have to have more than our life experience in order to be effective in peer support. So it's a matter of training, it's a matter of coaching, it's a matter of supervision, it's a matter of support, it's a matter of acting in alignment with the values in ways that we hold each other and ourselves accountable. But in addition to that, that is the exact same thing I say to any organization in any human service delivery. This is not unique to peer support. That in any kind of a work environment, if we are not thinking about power, diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and survivor-driven approaches to the work, we are missing the boat and will continue to perpetuate harms at work. So it's not just a peer support thing, it's a work thing. And I think part of the challenge is that we often believe in peer support, that if we have this life experience to share, that's all we need. And that is not true. So for me, I would love to see all of our workspaces be more equitable, to hold each other in this space where we can balance accommodation and accountability. And I have supervised people in this movement. So let me just be clear about that. So I'm speaking from several years of supervising people who identify as peers doing the work that we do. And that supervision and those approaches are necessary every single day. And the same thing is true whether I work in clinical support, and I have, whether I'm running housing programs, and I have, whether I'm running foster care programs, and I have. So there's a reason why these are the conversations. It's because these are universal experiences across the world of work.
Kathy, may I just add, when you do go into these subject matters, I'm talking more about the advocacy world, and which is not so formally organized.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, I've worked in advocacy. Yeah, in peer support, but also in domestic and sexual violence advocacy. And what I will tell you is that the issues are parallel. They're parallel. And if we work in human services at all, we need to look at our power and use of power over others. If there's one main theme, it would be that, and balancing, as I said before, accommodation and accountability. And so again, happy to have way more conversation than we can have time for today about this, but it's a theme, and your instincts are right in that change needs to happen. But I would also say that is true across human services. I think the additional challenge I will mention is that when we hire advocates and then we co-opt their purpose, that also undermines what folks can do and how folks show up. And so when we hire folks for peer support, or we think about creating spaces for advocacy, such as peer support, which is, one of many, that we have to consider what is really going on in this mix when things go bad. What we tend to do is push beyond it, or we have big reactions of, oh, let's shut it down, rather than let's fix it, or let's address it. Let's look at what it takes. And so for me, I would love every single advocate, every single person who provides peer support to really think about and be engaged in ongoing learning, coaching, and development around power, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, around how we show up at work. And what does it mean to balance accountability and accommodation?
So there was a conversation going on in the chat, and I think this is a good place before you move further. And folks were talking about fawning and fight, flight, and freeze situations. So it says basically fight, flight, freeze are biologically ingrained universally with all persons, our biological makeup. But the term fawning isn't biological, it's learned. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's social. It's socially learned. And there are many, many, many survival strategies that are socially learned. So if I know that someone could potentially be a threat to me, I may avoid that person. I'm thinking very clearly, it's not a reaction. I'm thinking very clearly, I am not going to go near that person if I can help it. But now if that person's my supervisor, what do I do? So there are all kinds of socially learned ways of coping with fear and coping with threat. The ones that are automatic and biological: fight, flight, freeze. Ingrained in human nature since the dawn of time. But when we look at these more social things, it's like, I see where that helped you survive. It's something that you learned over time. And that would be the difference between those. Any other thoughts, anybody? This is a great conversation. Thank you so much. I want us to talk about dysregulation a little bit. And this is important because dysregulation is what's happening internally when the human body is responding to threat. And so we tend to think about, oh yeah, I know what a trauma response looks like. Well, it could be any of these things and more. And so the dysregulation is that sense of I'm not controlling what is happening inside my body right now. And so again, keep in mind, trauma responses are not something that we're typically looking for. Something happens in our environment or the feeling that we get of not being safe, and our body responds in these ways. So dysregulated thoughts could be racing thoughts, jumbled thoughts. Could be I can't hold a thought. I can't keep a thought in my brain. I can't finish something. So if I'm having a dysregulated moment or month and I can't really think and my thoughts are really scattered, it's going to be very difficult for me to show up for work and be productive and show up in good ways for people I intend to support. Dysregulated emotions could be crying, yelling, raging, expressing this anger. It could be just this profound sense of loss and disconnection. And that could be something that I, again, don't have control over. I may want to show up. I may want to be calm and present that way. But for whatever reason, I cannot. And we often, get worried when folks are too much, too loud, too boisterous, too angry, too this or too that. But sometimes it's when people are too quiet, isolated, alone, that we need to also be concerned for them and reach out and make connection. Sometimes dysregulation can look like a person not being aware of what their body is actually doing in the space that they're in. An example, I was running a housing program and I had a staff member who had experienced something they hadn't shared, didn't know about it. But all of a sudden I noticed that the staff person would stand in the doorway of the office, hands on hips, so their elbows were way out. And so their body would take up the entire doorway. And that anyone who was coming in and out had to say, excuse me, or ask them to move. And so I pointed it out because it was annoying. And the behavior itself was annoying, that people felt like they shouldn't come to the office. And so residents in the housing program might need something and not come in because this person was blocking the doorway. So we had to talk about it. And when I asked, what's going on with this? And the first thing is that she didn't even notice she was doing it. She had no awareness that that's what was happening. And then she shared something that had happened to her. And she was really trying to just keep control over her own safety, but she wasn't aware that that's what was happening. So we talked about it. And she made use of our employee assistance program. She took some time off from work because this was a big deal what happened to her. And then when she was ready, she came back to work. And so it's recognizing and noticing and naming what we see. Sometimes people have dysregulated energy. I had 2 kids, one of them was, if she was doing anything, she was doing 4 things at once, and the other had 2 speeds, slow and asleep. And so we would talk about how different they were, but one person can experience that wave of energy in a day, in an hour, in a moment. And so it's noticing that this is what trauma does to our body, to our energy, to our thoughts, to our feelings. Sometimes a person feels safe and comfortable. Other times, even though nothing seemingly changes, they don't feel safe or they feel extremely uncomfortable. And so it's that sense of not being able to predict how I'm doing, how I'm feeling. And sometimes I feel connected, sometimes I don't. And sometimes folks struggle with being present in the here and now, sometimes called dissociation, sometimes called lots of other things in a clinical sense. But it makes sense that someone would feel that disrupted sense of being present for themselves, aware of who they are and how they are, but also disruption, a sense of being present for others. And so what we know is that all of this experience can disrupt how we function, that it's hard to plan and organize. It's hard to think about how we're showing up. It's hard to monitor and be your own internal supervisor. Like, I know I can look in the mirror and say, oh, Kathy, it's going to be a rough day today. Well, sometimes when trauma is in the mix, we don't have that kind of thought process. It's like, I thought it was going to be a good day. I was doing okay until I wasn't. So those are things that come up. Sometimes people have a hard time controlling their impulses, hard time solving problems, being able to think critically for themselves, by themselves or with others, to be able to think about the future. So if we think about how this shows up in a workplace, someone might not have judgment. They may not be able to learn from their experience or their mistakes and keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And so from an employer position, we might be looking at that and saying, oh, well, this is not a good hire. Where we might want to start with, I wonder what's in the mix and what are some things we can do to help with planning and structure and trying some of those kinds of ideas rather than blaming and othering someone who may be struggling. So all kinds of things for us to think about when humans work with other humans. So how all of this might look is someone may be overwhelmed or have really strong reactions to things that seem like small, like something that would just be an annoyance. They are like just, on the ceiling about it. Scanning for danger, always worrying that bad things are going to happen, or numbing and checking out because there's just so much happening that there's this internal shutting down. And so someone might seem unapproachable when what they're really trying to do is just to manage that there's too much noise, too much chaos, too much happening. People don't get over things that might happen, but hang on to it. A year from now, they're still talking about that thing that you did to me that day. So that happens, and it's a response to trauma, right? Disengaging or avoiding people, minimizing. I want to talk about compartmentalizing because as humans, we do it. Compartmentalizing is when you are able to set aside your own pain, your own stuff, and just focus on what's in front of you, either on your own or with the person. And we get praise when we do that. We set aside our pain, we set aside our worries, we set aside our own, real life heartache and hard times to do something else. And it's a skill. It can be incredibly useful as a coping strategy. But when we keep setting aside, the other thing that can happen is that we can set things aside so much that they bubble to the top when we're not ready for them. And so just to think about that in terms of our own life and our own experiences. And it's hard to, yeah.
If I could, there's a couple of interesting pieces added
Sure.
to your chat here. One
Great.
of them says, one, they acknowledge very interesting conversation. I wonder that conditioning extends to people who are socially conditioned or grow up in condition that promote being tough, becoming aggressive, and fight when there is conflict, when
Yes.
triggered, or to cope with threat and adverse conditions.
Yes. And one thing I will say is you've not heard me use the word trigger today on purpose. What I like to talk about is when someone says they're triggered or I've been triggered, it means that something has activated their fear response and there are trauma reminders. And so we need to think about in terms of what is actually happening to a person is all the stuff we've been talking about in terms of dysregulation. What's happening is that people can't plan. What's happening is people are having this response that has overwhelmed or hijacked their capacities to plan, and they are overwhelmed. So when we talk about being triggered or something is triggering, it's something has activated their fear response. And it helps us to think about things as trauma responses rather than kind of shrinking that down to something that is just a word. So that's what I would advocate for.
Thank you. I want to add one more. Someone asked, would unfair pay cause you to have trauma in the workplace? Example, peer coworker who doesn't have the experience and are just starting out in the field makes more than a person who has been there for years.
So, well, that is an example of an absolute inequity. And unfortunately, the field, human services, the places where people work are full of inequities. And that's an example. Inequities can be unfair. They can be harming. They can be traumatizing. They can be overwhelming. So sure, I think where I'm cautious is whether or not something is inequitable doesn't necessarily make it trauma. Inequities can be traumatizing, but it's not always that one brings the other. Trauma is a response to threat. And so what we have to think about in our workplaces are what are the things that may signal threat. And when we have threats and we have a response to that and our behaviors change, that those things are labeled. And the problem with labeling is that they don't define current experience. And that if you tell me, oh, I'm this or I'm behaving these ways, I might not use the same language as you to describe that. There's not necessarily a label that usually we're labeling someone to other them or to diagnose them or to put them in some box that we've created. That boxing in of people is unhelpful and it's unhealthy. When people are in their greatest distress, we are starting to name their behavior, and then we start to make their behavior the person. So we label the person. We don't think about trauma. We decide who's in and who's good to have around and who's out. We like to link it to compliance rather than more of connection. So what heals trauma is connection. That is the antidote, right? It's connection. So all the things we do when we label is to other people. We're not connecting in those moments. And so as we talk about healing, in a moment, I would like to bring Tina Brooks into the conversation so we can talk about some resources. But before we do, just again, what helps to heal is control over your life and your environment, a sense of both physical and emotional safety, being able to trust other people, connection, and specifically connection with people who are trustworthy, and then opportunities that support healing. And so when in peer support, just to refer back to the earlier question, we're not showing up in trustworthy ways for other people, we may be doing harm. And so healing allows me to begin to trust myself, to trust my decisions, to trust my capacities for relationship. So if that's undermined, then that leaves me feeling more on edge rather than moving towards healing and connection. So I want folks to just kind of think about that as we start to talk about some resources for support and to wrap up. So I want to check, is Tina here and ready to talk with us about some of the activities that you've been up to with the network?
I am. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, and let me know when to advance slides for you. I'm happy to do it.
Okay, great. First of all, that was an absolutely wonderful presentation. I came in a little bit late, but just learned so much always. Every time I hear you speak, it's just wonderful. So just thank you for that. One of the things that I think, in just sort of thinking about the work that I've done around trauma and how I started being involved with this work is, once you start to learn more, people really want to find ways to connect with each other and share this information. And that's one of the goals of the New York State Trauma Informed Network. It's funded by the New York State Office of Mental Health, and the network has been in existence since, I believe, 2016 or 2017, and the goal is really to bring together people from around the state who are trauma champions. And, we use the phrase trauma champions just broadly for people who understand the principles of trauma and trauma-informed practice and really are champions for the work and want to see expanded in community settings and organizations and really everywhere. And the network has really been a place to bring together individuals and community members who are interested in just that, sort of learning more about trauma, connecting with other people around New York State who are doing this work as well, and sharing resources. So the first page that I'm showing you is actually the home page for the New York State Trauma Informed Network. We've looked at trying to use the network as a virtual platform primarily for people throughout New York State to connect, and there's a few ways that we are able to do that. If you look on the first page, you'll see there's a tab up the front at the top of the web page where you can register. So you can register to become a member of the network. So you then are a part of one of the resources. Someone in New York State or New York City can reach out and learn about your organization, or you can become an individual member as well. So there's a general place there to share resources about events you may be sponsoring. You can also do a search for events you may want to participate in potentially, or any sort of training, or also any sort of resources or tools that you might be interested in. A lot of folks, when they start to really think more about this work, one of the big questions is, how do I implement some of this work in my agency, in my community setting? And we have a lot of resources that are available through the website that can help you do that. One thing I also wanted to point out that's available through the network is called the Trust. And it's actually a virtual tool that you can use to do an assessment of how trauma-informed or how ready your organization is to become trauma-informed. We often know we want our organizations to change and progress, but it's a process, and really sort of getting a sense of where your organization is at so you can really kind of think about what's the best way I can have impact. It is a really important thing to sort of think about. The Trust just does just that. There's a series of questions that you can walk through, and we provide some technical assistance through the network to support people in sort of thinking about how to complete the trust. And, now that I've done it, then what sort of resources and supports are available as well. So there's staff that are actually working on the trust that can support you in thinking about some of that work. Kath, if you could go to the next slide. And And we, just in terms of who's in the network, I work at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and the Office of Consumer Affairs, and we are a partner with the New York State Trauma Informed Network. We participate and support the network. So it's really open to the cross-sector of different people and different providers groups. We have OMH is Mahaney's, our state partner, CTAC. We have members who are peers. We have folks who are in the healthcare settings. People are working in education and justice settings. So it's really a diverse group of people who are involved in the network. And the only requirement to join the network is just to have interest in this work and wanting to expand it. Everything that's made available through the network is free of charge and available and accessible through the website. Next slide. When I want to talk about a little bit more about some work in New York City, it's been done, but just to give you some more examples of things that have happened through the network, we have a quarterly meeting that again is statewide that anyone can join by Zoom. We do a range of different quarterly topics based on trauma and resilience, and they vary. We've had a workforce-focused regional meeting that we've held. We've focused on spirituality. It's a range of different topics. Again, they're open to anyone in New York State. There's always a presentation from a presenter and then opportunities to network throughout the state. We have regional networking rooms that we break out during the second half of our meeting. So again, that's another opportunity to meet and connect with people statewide who are interested in doing trauma responsive work and sort of bringing that work into their agency or community. Some of the other things that we've done as well, we recently started to develop a training of trainers pilot that is been piloted over the past year, and we're looking to expand significantly in 2023. We have recruited people and provided a comprehensive training on trauma informed principles. It's meant to be a one-on-one training. One of the things that was important for us when we started thinking about developing a training of trainers was making sure that people had access to this information and also that there's standardized language. We know that people talk about trauma. Trauma is a big part of, I think, of our language and as a society right now, but just making sure that there's some standardized and shared understanding of what some of the concepts are. So that's really what the training of trainers and the trainers curriculum is meant to do, to give an overview and a one-on-one training that can be delivered by peers in the community setting. And we have our first cohort of trainers who completed, I believe, last year. We're looking and hopefully expanding that and recruiting more trainers. So there should be more information coming about that if you would like to have a training in your agency, or if you're someone who does training already and might be interested in becoming a trainer for your agency. That's another way that you could be involved and work with the network. Some other examples of things that we have done is we do have a blog where people can share information about upcoming events in their community, any sort of articles about work that you're doing. One of the things that we want to do as Trauma Champions is really elevate work. We know that folks are doing great work. So if there's something that you're really excited about at your organization that you want to share, that's another opportunity and another platform where you can share that information. The other thing that we've been looking at and thinking about in New York City, and this is again through the network, is just sort of what's happening in New York City. And again, we know in New York City there's always a lot going on and people doing great work, but sort of started thinking about how can we connect at the local level. And so that is, we've developed is sort of a complement of the network, the New York City Trauma Resilience Collaborative. And I'm facilitating that with my colleague Jim Rodriguez at CTAC. And it's really meant to be, again, another opportunity for people in New York City to come together to share resources, to hear updates about things that are happening statewide. We're going to be having presenters coming in as well, and starting in 2023 to talk more about just some of the innovative things that are happening in New York City. So the overall goal of the network and just everything that we're doing is really about helping people connect, share information and resources, and seek support if you're looking and thinking about how to move some of this work forward, because we know that it's not easy. The level of change that's really required, I think, to move from being trauma-informed and being trauma-responsive is really, it's a lot, and we really want to build in as much support as possible. So we're all excited to really have the network as a resource. And again, I hope you will consider registering through the website. My email, I believe, is on one of the last slides, so please feel free to reach out to me if you have any trouble registering, if you have any general questions about the network. So that's it for me.
Tina, thank you so much. And I want to, in our last couple of minutes, to bring in Rita to talk about the evaluation and next steps, but I wanted to just share this quick quote around what it takes. You know, it's healing is natural and it's really possible. And so it's up to us to figure out ways to support that and for us to think about ways that we can continue the conversation. So we have 2 more webinars. There's some additional resources. This toolkit that's here was created by a peer-run program with another mental health program and with our national center. And so it's a way of looking at all the aspects of program and services and saying, you know, how are we doing with this? So it's a self-reflection toolkit. And as promised, there's our contact information, and Tina's is here. So Rita, do you want to take it from here?
Certainly. Thank you both so much, and Skip as well, for a wonderful presentation. And you already mentioned it, but I just wanted to remind people that there are 2 more webinars coming up. One is on Thursday, February 16th, and the one after that is on Thursday, March 16th. So those were about a month apart on each of these. We'll make sure that we have a little bit more information for you coming soon. I will be posting the recording of this webinar probably in about 5 days or so, but we'll send out the handouts before that, and we'll send out information for you to complete. I've got a survey for you to complete, but I'm going to send that to you by email. And I just wanted to say again, thank you to Kathy and the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. I wanted to say thank you to Tina for giving us a presentation on the New York State Trauma Informed Network, for Skip for the New York City Justice Peer Initiative, and again, our partners here at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Carlton Whitmore, and thank you, Patrice, for partnering with me on this series through the Peer and Community Health Worker Workforce Consortium. I'm Rita with the Academy of Peer Services, and thank you again all for coming. Have a great day.